What we are watching right now is not just another Middle East flare-up. It is not just Israel striking Iran, and it is not just the United States backing an ally from a distance. What began on February 28, 2026 as a joint US-Israeli campaign against Iran has already become something much larger, a war over deterrence, regime survival, oil regional order, and the question of whether military dominance can actually produce political control. Reuters reports that the opening strikes killed Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, triggered Iranian retaliation across Israel and Gulf states hosting US bases, and quickly pulled energy markets and international diplomacy into the conflict. And that is why this war matters even if you live thousands of miles away. Because wars like this are never just about the first explosion. They are about the chain reaction that follows. The missiles are the obvious part. The less obvious part is what happens next. Oil shocks, shipping disruptions, inflation pressure, legal backlash, secession struggles, and the possibility that what looks like a clean, tactical victory in the air turns into a much messier strategic problem on the ground and in the global economy. That is the real story here. It is not just who can hit harder, it is who can shape what comes after. That analytical frame is supported by the way the conflict has already spilled from military targets into leadership politics, Gulf security, and energy markets. To understand why this is so dangerous, start with the opening move. Reuters describes the February 28th strikes as the most ambitious attack on Iranian targets in decades. Around 200 Israeli aircraft hit roughly 500 targets across Iran, while the United States joined what Washington called Operation Epic Fury. Khamenei was killed, along with other senior Iranian figures, and Trump framed the campaign as a way to eliminate imminent threats and stop Iran from developing a nuclear weapon. Iran called the attack illegal and unprovoked. From the first day, this was not designed as a symbolic warning. It was a decapitation strike aimed at the core of the Iranian system. That matters because decapitation strikes do two things at once. First, they can create the appearance of overwhelming control. You hit command centers, kill leaders, destroy air defenses, and show the region that you can reach almost anywhere. But second, they create a vacuum, and vacuums are rarely stable. They invite retaliation, succession battles, internal paranoia, and escalatory logic. In other words, once you decide to kill the top of the pyramid, you are no longer just managing a threat. You are intervening in the future shape of an entire state. That is my analysis. But it follows directly from the scale of the opening attack and from how quickly the war moved from military strikes to questions about who would rule Iran next. From Israel's perspective, the logic is clear. Israel wants to permanently reduce Iran's ability to threaten it through missiles, nuclear advances, and proxy warfare. This is the culmination of a longer doctrine. Don't just deter the threat, dismantle the network that generates it. Reuters notes that Israeli officials had been thinking about eliminating Khamenei for months, and that the war has since expanded to include Iranian commanders in Lebanon and a widening campaign against Hezbollah-linked positions. In that sense, Israel is not just fighting Iran. It is trying to redraw the security map of the region in one sweeping campaign. But there is a major difference between degrading capabilities and producing a favorable political outcome. Military force is very good at destroying assets. It is much worse at controlling the social and political response to destruction. And that is where Iran's side of the story becomes important. Iran does not need to defeat the United States and Israel in a straight conventional contest to make this war costly. It only needs to survive, retaliate enough to signal resilience, and raise the regional and global price of continuing the war. That appears to be exactly what Tehran has tried to do: hit Israel, strike or threaten Gulf states that host U.S. military assets, and turn geography into leverage through the Strait of Hormuz. That is an inference from events, but it is grounded in the pattern Reuters describes across the past week. That brings us to the most important map in this whole war: the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow waterway handles around 1/5 of global oil consumption. And from the first day of the war, Iran signaled that it could disrupt it. Reuters reports that fears of prolonged disruption there pushed oil sharply higher. And by March 9th, Brent had surged as much as 19.8% in early trade to $111.04 a barrel, while U.S. crude rose as much as 22.4% to $111.24, the highest levels since July 2022. Even if some of that spike eases, the message is clear. This war is no longer just about missiles and air defenses. It is now an energy shock with global consequences. And once oil becomes part of the story, the war stops being regional in any meaningful sense. It starts leaking into fuel, shipping, aviation, food transport, manufacturing, and consumer sentiment everywhere else. Reuters reported that by March 7th, the U.S. national average for regular gasoline had already risen to $3.32 per gallon, up 11% in a week, while diesel hit $4.33, up 15%. That may sound like a side story next to bombings and missiles, but politically it is not. It means the war can show up in ordinary life, not just through headlines, but through the price of a commute, a delivery, or a plane ticket. And for governments, that matters because once wars start hurting wallets, domestic support becomes much more fragile. This is where the United States faces its biggest gamble. Trump came into office promising strength without endless entanglement. But this war is increasingly testing whether that promise can survive contact with reality. Reuters reports that Trump has demanded Iran's unconditional surrender, said Washington should have a say in selecting Iran's next leader, and indicated that combat operations would continue until U.S. objectives are met. The more maximalist those goals become, the harder it is to find an exit ramp. If your war aims shift from reducing a threat to reshaping a country's leadership and strategic posture, you are no longer talking about a limited strike. You are talking about open-ended coercion with no clear boundary. And that is the trap. Tactical momentum can create strategic overconfidence. If the opening week goes well militarily, decision-makers can start believing that more pressure will finally break the other side. But history is full of campaigns where initial dominance only deepened long-term instability. Iran's rulers do not have to be loved to keep fighting. They do not have to win cleanly to survive. They simply have to convince enough insiders, security forces, and regional actors that surrender would be worse than continued resistance. That is analysis, not direct reporting, but it is strongly supported by the fact that even after Khamenei's death, the Iranian system did not collapse. It regrouped, and the clearest symbol of that regrouping is succession. Reuters reports that Iran's Assembly of Experts has now named Mojtaba Khamenei, the son of the late Supreme Leader, as the new Supreme Leader. That signals not moderation, not compromise, but continuity under hardline control. Reuters also reports that Iranian armed institution quickly pledged allegiance to him, even as Israel threatened to pursue every successor to Khamenei. This is one of the most important developments in the war, because it suggests that the decapitation strike did not fragment the state in the way outside powers may have hoped. It may actually have hardened it. If that interpretation is right, then one of the war's central ironies becomes obvious. A campaign launched to reduce the Iranian threat may end up selecting for the most uncompromising version of that threat. Kill the leader, intensify the siege mentality, and elevate a successor whose legitimacy is tied not to reform, but to defiance. That does not mean Iran becomes stronger in a material sense. It has clearly taken severe damage, but it may become more rigid, more paranoid, and more willing to fuse regime survival with permanent confrontation. In strategic terms, that can be worse than dealing with a weakened but more flexible adversary. This is analysis based on the hardline succession outcome and the rhetoric on both sides. The regional layer makes this even more dangerous. Saudi Arabia has warned Iran not to keep attacking the kingdom or its energy sector, while Iran says it will stop hitting Gulf states unless attacks on Iran come from their territory. In other words, nobody wants the Gulf pulled fully into this war, but everyone is preparing for that outcome. And that is the real danger now. Not just a war between Israel, Iran, and the U.S., but a conflict that keeps widening, even as every side claims it wants to contain it.